In the late 1840s, Boston was in the midst of rapid industrial growth, its streets crowded with merchants, dock workers, and newly arrived immigrants seeking stability in a changing world. Within this atmosphere of expansion stood the Murwalls Mortuary, a quiet, dignified establishment on a narrow cobblestone street. Outwardly, it was a place of order and professionalism, where matters of death were handled with the utmost decorum. But in 1848, a series of neglected papers, stored deep within the mortuary's record room, began to attract the attention of a clerk with an unusual eye for detail. What began as a simple matter of misplaced documents would evolve into a pattern of omissions, altered registers, and administrative silences that hinted at a long-standing practice concealed from public view. The Murwalls Mortuary was considered one of the most respected funeral establishments in Boston between 1843 and 1849. Founded by Charles and Edwin Murwall, two brothers from a family of merchants, it was known for its precision in record-keeping and its adherence to municipal regulations concerning death registration. The mortuary was contracted not only by private citizens, but also by hospitals, almshouses, and even the city's own Board of Health, handling cases that ranged from the modest to the socially prominent. Clients appreciated the discretion with which the Murwalls conducted their affairs, rarely questioning the speed or manner in which arrangements were completed. Their staff appeared disciplined and efficient, their facilities well maintained, and their paperwork exemplary. For years, no one doubted the accuracy of the ledgers or the completeness of the archives, and few would have imagined that anything of significance could be concealed within so routine an operation. The Murwalls Mortuary occupied a three-story brick building on Dock Street, a short walk from the busy wharves where goods from across the Atlantic arrived daily. Its facade was unremarkable by Boston standards, but it carried an understated refinement that reflected the city's professional class in the mid-19th century. The entryway was framed by polished wooden doors, kept immaculate regardless of the season, and a brass plate bore the inscription, "Murwalls & Comer, Funeral Services and Arrangements." The interior was ordered and muted, with a reception room containing sturdy chairs, a wide desk for clerical work, and tall cabinets for storing documents. Visitors encountered an air of calm efficiency from the moment they crossed the threshold. Charles Murwall, the elder of the two brothers, was often the first to greet clients. His voice was steady, his attire conservative, and his manner reserved yet attentive. Edwin, the younger, oversaw much of the mortuary's operational work, ensuring that schedules were kept and that formalities required by the city were observed without deviation. Both men presented themselves as committed to propriety, never overstepping the professional boundary that separated personal sentiment from official duty. In a city whose population was steadily increasing, they understood that their reputation depended on maintaining a constant sense of order and dependability. The work of the mortuary extended beyond private commissions. Municipal authorities relied on the Murwalls to handle cases in which the deceased had no family or when immediate arrangements were required by public institutions. The city's almshouses, which housed the destitute and infirm, often sent notices to the Murwalls when residents passed away. Likewise, small medical facilities without dedicated mortuary staff would contract their services for prompt and organized handling. The brothers accepted these contracts with the same quiet diligence they applied to their private clientele. In the office, a small group of clerks maintained meticulous registers. These volumes recorded names, dates, causes as listed by physicians, and the eventual location of burial. Boston's regulatory framework required such records for both public health monitoring and legal purposes, and the Murwalls staff complied with precision. Each entry was written in a neat hand, the ink carefully chosen to ensure legibility over time. On occasion, municipal inspectors would visit to review these ledgers, and the Murwalls books consistently met the standards expected of them. The mortuary's rooms were arranged for efficiency rather than display. Behind the reception area lay the administrative office, and further back a series of storage rooms for the supplies required in their trade. One of these was devoted entirely to documentation. Tall shelves, some reaching nearly to the ceiling, were lined with bound ledgers, correspondence from clients and institutions, and official forms. Access to this room was generally restricted to the clerks and the brothers themselves. The arrangement ensured that every matter, once concluded, could be referenced without difficulty should questions arise. Public perception of the Murwalls mortuary was shaped not only by its reliability, but also by its ability to remain unobtrusive. Boston's professional and merchant classes valued discretion, and the Murwalls never drew unnecessary attention to their work. Announcements in newspapers were made only at the request of clients, and any transactions with the city were handled without public comment. The building itself blended into the rhythm of Dock Street, its activities visible only to those who had reason to enter. In the social circles where municipal and business leaders gathered, the Murwalls were known as competent and trustworthy service providers. Charles occasionally attended civic meetings, particularly when matters of public health were under discussion, lending the mortuary's experience to debates on regulation and procedure. Edwin was less visible in such forums, preferring to remain within the operational side of the business, but his reputation among suppliers and municipal clerks was one of punctuality and fairness. Neither brother sought prominence beyond their profession. The clientele they served ranged widely in means and status. Affluent families appreciated the refinement of the Murwalls arrangements, which included prompt consultation, clear communication, and the handling of all necessary documentation. At the same time, the mortuary fulfilled modest arrangements for those of limited means, often under municipal contracts. In either case, the process followed was the same, adhering strictly to Boston's administrative requirements. In this way, the Murwalls reinforced an image of impartiality, treating each case as a matter of record rather than social distinction. In an era when the city was grappling with the challenges of rapid growth, including the expansion of its residential districts and the increased complexity of municipal oversight, the stability offered by the Murwalls operation was valued. Officials knew that instructions sent to Dock Street would be carried out without delay or deviation. Private citizens, when referred to the mortuary by acquaintances or by institutions, could expect the same degree of attentiveness. This consistency created a cycle of trust that strengthened the mortuary's position year after year. The brothers also cultivated cooperative relationships with other trades that intersected with their work. Stonecutters, carriage operators, and suppliers of necessary materials all regarded the Murwalls as prompt in their dealings and clear in their terms. These relationships, while primarily practical, reinforced the mortuary's standing within the network of businesses that supported Boston's growing urban infrastructure. Such connections allowed the Murwalls to operate smoothly, even during periods of high demand. Visitors to the mortuary often remarked on the absence of unnecessary ornamentation. The decor was functional, favoring polished wood, plain fabrics, and subdued lighting. This approach aligned with the mid-century sensibilities of Boston's professional establishments, where restraint was often equated with dignity. The building's quiet atmosphere, combined with the precision of its administrative work, made it a model of efficiency in a field where delays and errors could cause public dissatisfaction. While many of their competitors relied on personal charm or grand displays to secure clients, the Murwalls placed their confidence in administrative thoroughness. They ensured that every requirement set by the city was documented, every ledger kept current, and every request filed properly. This approach minimized disputes, which in turn shielded them from the kind of scrutiny that occasionally troubled less disciplined operators. Their success rested on the perception that their work was both necessary and above reproach. The nature of their records was such that they formed a complete archive of the mortuary's dealings. Names, dates, institutional correspondences, and municipal notices filled the shelves of the record room. For most observers, these were simply the inevitable byproducts of a well-run business. Few outside the mortuary gave thought to the accumulation of such information or to the way it documented patterns of municipal and private activity over time. For the Murwalls, the archive was both a tool of daily operations and a symbol of their commitment to order. The staff reflected the brothers' professional values. Clerks were chosen for their reliability and adherence to procedure. They were trained in the mortuary's methods of filing and record-keeping, and mistakes were rare. Many of these clerks remained with the mortuary for years, some even decades, creating a continuity that further enhanced the establishment's efficiency. This stability was a key factor in the public's confidence, as familiar faces at the desk reassured returning clients that the business was in steady hands. By 1848, the Murwalls mortuary was regarded as an integral part of Boston's civic and commercial structure. Its presence on Dock Street was as predictable as the daily movements of the port traffic nearby. For those who interacted with it, whether in times of personal need or as part of official duty, it represented a dependable point in the city's complex and often shifting framework. The brothers had built their reputation on a foundation of precision, discretion, and adherence to the formalities of their profession, and nothing in their outward conduct suggested that this foundation was anything less than solid. And the routines at the Murwalls mortuary were so well established by the late 1840s that even small deviations were quickly noted by staff. Each morning began with the arrival of Charles or Edwin, depending on their respective schedules, and a brief review of the day's appointments. The clerks would then retrieve any documents related to those cases from the archive room, ensuring that necessary forms and correspondence were ready for signature or delivery. This rhythm gave the impression of a finely tuned operation, one in which every task had a designated place and time. The archive room itself was the quiet center of this process. It occupied a space at the rear of the building, away from the sound of the street and the movement of clients. Its shelves were arranged in narrow rows, with ledgers grouped by year and cross-referenced to municipal records. The room was kept dry and clean, and an oil lamp was always available for clerks working in its dimmer corners. Each volume was bound in sturdy leather, with the year and a simple notation embossed on the spine. For those who worked there, these books represented the lifeblood of the business, the tangible record of every agreement, every arrangement, and every obligation fulfilled. Within Boston's growing network of public services, the mortuary's reliability had earned it an unusual level of trust. City officials could send notices without follow-up, confident that the necessary arrangements would be made promptly. In turn, the Murwalls ensured that the official paperwork was always returned in the expected format and timeframe. This reciprocal understanding not only simplified municipal procedures, but also gave the mortuary a degree of autonomy rarely afforded to private contractors. They were, in effect, a private enterprise that operated as seamlessly as a city department. The brothers maintained their standing through careful social positioning. Charles, in particular, understood the importance of appearing in the right company at civic gatherings. He was known to converse with members of the Board of Health, local magistrates, and the occasional representative from Boston's merchant associations. These interactions were polite, concise, and focused on practical matters. By avoiding unnecessary commentary or personal opinion, Charles preserved an image of impartiality that suited the mortuary's role. Edwin, though less inclined toward such gatherings, occasionally accompanied his brother, standing quietly at the edges of conversation, but observing closely. The physical environment of Dock Street played its own role in shaping perceptions. The street was lined with modest yet well-kept buildings, many of which housed offices or warehouses related to the shipping trade. Carriages moved steadily along the cobblestones, and porters carried crates to and from the wharves. Against this background of steady commerce, the mortuary's quiet facade appeared almost as a counterpoint, a place set apart from the noise and movement. Passers-by rarely stopped to look closely, and those who entered usually did so with purpose rather than curiosity. Inside, the mortuary's staff upheld an atmosphere of formality. Conversations in the reception room were conducted in low, measured tones. Papers were handled with care, and no item of business was concluded without proper notation. The clerks were trained not only in their immediate tasks, but also in the broader structure of the mortuary's operations. They knew how to track correspondence between the mortuary and city offices, how to prepare forms for official inspection, and how to store completed records in the correct sequence. This discipline ensured that even in periods of high demand, the work did not fall into disarray. The mortuary's clientele included a small but steady number of institutions whose needs extended beyond occasional contracts. These included charitable organizations responsible for managing the affairs of residents who had no family, as well as certain small hospitals. Such arrangements required ongoing coordination, and the Murwalls approached them with the same methodical care applied to all their work. Every notice received was acknowledged, and every service provided was documented in writing. The resulting paper trail was as much a testament to their efficiency as the services themselves. Although the Murwalls rarely discussed their business in public, they were not without influence in their sphere. Suppliers often prioritized their orders, knowing that prompt delivery would lead to continued patronage. City clerks, familiar with the precision of the mortuary's submissions, often processed their paperwork ahead of others. This network of mutual reliability created a subtle but durable advantage, one that allowed the mortuary to maintain its position without resorting to overt competition. Within the building, the roles of Charles and Edwin were clearly defined but complementary. Charles managed most of the correspondence and maintained contact with municipal authorities. Edwin oversaw the physical and logistical aspects of the mortuary's operations, ensuring that schedules were met and that staff adhered to established protocols. This division of labor reduced the risk of oversight and allowed each brother to focus on his strengths. Both took an active interest in the archive room, regarding it as the foundation of their enterprise. On certain afternoons when the flow of work permitted, Charles would review past years' records to ensure that they remained in proper order. He took care to replace worn labels, repair frayed binding, and confirm that each volume corresponded with municipal filings. Edwin, while less concerned with the fine details of labeling, was equally attentive to the completeness of the records. This ongoing maintenance reflected their understanding that the archive was not merely a repository, but an active component of the mortuary's credibility. The building's layout facilitated this focus on documentation. From the reception room, one could pass through the clerk's workspace and into the rear corridor leading to the archive. This arrangement meant that all files passed through a central point of review before being stored. Clerks were expected to confirm that every document was properly dated, signed and cross-referenced before it left their desks. Errors were addressed immediately, as the brothers believed that even minor inconsistencies could, if left uncorrected, undermine the entire system. Beyond the daily routines, the Murwalls occasionally received visits from municipal inspectors or from representatives of the institutions with which they contracted. These inspections were often brief, as the mortuary's records consistently met expectations. Visitors were shown the relevant ledgers, the filing system, and the current year's correspondence. The orderliness of these materials was often remarked upon, and such remarks reinforced the establishment's standing in official circles. By 1848, the mortuary's stability was such that it had become a fixed point in the city's administrative landscape. New clerks entering municipal service were often told to observe the Murwalls' methods as an example of proper record-keeping. The brothers' insistence on accuracy and their commitment to procedure were seen as qualities that contributed to the smooth operation of the city's broader systems. Their work, though conducted largely out of public view, was recognized among those who dealt with such matters as essential to the city's orderly function. Despite their prominence in this narrow sphere, the Murwalls remained personally unobtrusive. They did not seek social recognition beyond what was necessary for the conduct of their business, nor did they attempt to expand beyond their established capacity. Their focus was on maintaining the integrity of their existing operations rather than pursuing growth for its own sake. In a city undergoing constant change, this consistency was perhaps their greatest asset. The rhythm of their work, the structure of their records, and the formality of their conduct combined to produce an institution that appeared unshakable. The building on Dock Street, with its quiet facade and carefully maintained interiors, embodied the values the brothers had cultivated over years of steady labor. Those who passed through its doors encountered not just a business but a carefully maintained system, one in which every action was recorded, every record preserved, and every detail attended to with care. In early 1848, a minor but persistent irregularity began to surface in the Murwalls' mortuary's routine. It started with a routine request from a municipal clerk for the retrieval of a record from 3 years prior. Such requests were not unusual, as the Board of Health occasionally reviewed older cases to confirm data for statistical purposes. The document in question pertained to a municipal contract involving a small almshouse in the North End. The clerk expected that the mortuary's archive would yield the file quickly, as was customary. When the request was passed to the clerks on Dock Street, the process seemed straightforward. The index pointed clearly to the ledger for that year, and the appropriate page number was recorded in the margin. Yet, upon opening the ledger, the clerks found that the entry referenced in the index did not match the information expected. The name and date aligned with the municipal records, but the associated details were incomplete. Certain fields that were normally filled with precise notations were left blank, while others contained vague or abbreviated terms not typically used in the mortuary's work. The discovery was small enough that it could have been attributed to a clerical lapse, but the absence of detail stood out precisely because the Murwalls ledgers were otherwise so exact. Charles reviewed the entry himself, noting the unusual format and the lack of cross-references that normally appeared in the margin. When questioned, none of the clerks who had been employed during that year recalled an explanation for the irregularity. The incident was resolved for the municipal clerk by supplying a summary based on other sources, but the original inconsistency remained in the archive. In the weeks that followed, a second anomaly emerged. This time it involved a set of receipts for municipal services, filed under a series of contracts with a small medical facility. The receipts were present, but several bore mismatched dates that did not align with the events recorded in the corresponding ledger entries. Edwin examined these closely, suspecting perhaps a misfiled set of papers, yet the handwriting was consistent with that of the mortuary's clerks. The amounts charged were in keeping with standard municipal rates, and the signatures appeared genuine. The only irregularity was the sequence of dates, which created the impression that the paperwork had been prepared before certain arrangements were actually completed. Such details would have held little significance for most businesses, but the Murwalls operated in an environment where consistency was a form of currency. The brothers prided themselves on the precision of their records, and even small variations carried the potential to disrupt the image they had cultivated. Charles insisted that the anomalies be noted in an internal log, a private record of irregularities that was not part of the official archive. He reasoned that this would allow them to monitor any further occurrences without unnecessarily involving municipal authorities. The appearance of a third inconsistency came not from an official request, but from within the mortuary's own operations. A clerk, while reorganizing a section of the archive room to make space for the current year's files, found a folded sheet tucked between the pages of an older ledger. It was not bound into the book, and appeared to have been inserted after the ledger was completed. The sheet contained a list of names and dates, each with a brief notation. Several of the names corresponded to entries in the mortuary's official records, but the associated details were different from those in the ledgers. The handwriting was unfamiliar to the clerk and did not match that of either Murwall brother or any current staff member. Edwin reviewed the sheet in silence before placing it into the internal log with a notation to revisit the matter later. He did not offer an explanation to the clerk beyond saying that the paper was misplaced correspondence and should not be filed with the official records. The incident was not mentioned to municipal authorities, nor was it discussed in detail among the staff. Yet from that point forward, both brothers began to spend more time in the archive room, sometimes reviewing older volumes in the evenings after the clerks had gone. The staff noticed these changes but did not speculate openly. In a workplace that valued discretion, it was understood that certain matters were handled only by the proprietors. The increased attention to the archives was framed as routine maintenance, and the brothers continued to present themselves to clients and officials with their usual composure. However, those who worked closest to them could not fail to see that they now double-checked certain files before allowing them to leave the building, even for municipal inspection. The flow of irregularities did not diminish. In April of that year, the mortuary received an inquiry from a charitable society regarding a case from 1845. The society wished to confirm details of arrangements that, according to their own records, had been carried out by the Murwalls. When the corresponding ledger was retrieved, the entry was intact, but bore an annotation in the margin that did not match the style of the rest of the page. The handwriting was again unfamiliar, and the note was written in abbreviated form, offering no clear explanation for its presence. The society was given a summary based on the main entry, but the annotation remained unexplained. By mid-year, the internal log contained several such notations. While none were significant enough to raise concern outside the mortuary, the accumulation was notable. The brothers began to check all outgoing files for irregularities before they were sent to municipal or institutional offices. In some cases, they substituted copies made from other sources rather than sending the original documents. This practice, while maintaining the mortuary's public image, created a subtle shift in the way the business interacted with outside agencies. It was during this period that a municipal clerk named Samuel Kerr, who had worked with the Murwalls for several years, began to notice small delays in the return of documents sent to Dock Street for verification. Kerr was accustomed to receiving materials from the mortuary within a day or two of his request, yet several recent inquiries had taken a week or more. When he mentioned this to Charles in passing, the response was courteous but non-committal, attributing the delays to archival reorganization. Kerr accepted the explanation, though he privately remarked to a colleague that such delays were unusual for the Murwalls. In his experience, their efficiency had been as consistent as their handwriting. The colleague suggested that the mortuary might be experiencing staffing issues, but Kerr pointed out that the same clerks had been in place for years. The matter was left there, though Kerr began to make more detailed notes in his own files when dealing with Dock Street. Meanwhile, the brothers continued to conduct their business with outward normalcy. Contracts were fulfilled, clients received their arrangements without complaint, and municipal records were kept in compliance with regulations. Yet behind the facade of routine, the archive room had become the focus of increasingly frequent and private reviews by the proprietors. The locked cabinets, once opened only for specific purposes, were now accessed almost daily. For the clerks, the changes were subtle but perceptible. Requests to retrieve files were now accompanied by instructions to wait for approval before passing them on to the requesting party. In some cases, files were returned to the shelves with added notations, sometimes in the unfamiliar handwriting that had appeared in earlier anomalies. No explanations were given, and questions were discouraged. The staff adjusted to this new pattern, assuming that the brothers were simply refining their methods. By the close of summer 1848, the pattern of small but persistent irregularities had become a quiet undercurrent in the life of the mortuary. Nothing was openly amiss, yet the careful observer could see that a shift had taken place. The brothers' attention was increasingly drawn inward toward the shelves of ledgers and files that lined the archive room. Whatever the cause, it was being managed without public disclosure, contained within the walls of the brick building on Dock Street. In the autumn of 1848, the atmosphere within the Murwalls mortuary grew increasingly deliberate. What had once been a smooth exchange of documents between the clerks and municipal offices was now marked by pauses, reviews, and substitutions. While clients and institutions continued to receive the information they requested, the process by which it reached them had changed. Every file leaving the archive was subject to a second review by either Charles or Edwin, often in the privacy of the locked office at the rear of the building. On several occasions, a clerk would prepare a file for dispatch, only to be told that it required further checking. The file might remain in the office for days before being returned, sometimes altered in subtle ways. Dates were rewritten in a slightly different hand, annotations were rephrased, or marginal notes were removed entirely. The modifications were precise enough that they escaped casual notice, yet their frequency was new to the mortuary's operations. This quiet shift was accompanied by a noticeable change in the brothers' routines. Charles, who had once spent much of his day in the reception area or meeting with municipal representatives, now devoted long hours to the archive room. Edwin, whose focus had traditionally been on the logistical side of the business, began to involve himself more directly in the review of past records. Their conversations, when overheard by staff, tended to be short, technical, and directed toward specific ledger entries rather than general business matters. One late afternoon in October, a delivery from the Board of Health arrived containing a request for verification of 6 separate cases dating from 1846. The request was routine in format, but notable for the number of cases listed. The clerk assigned to retrieve the files found 5 of them without difficulty. The 6th, however, was not in its expected place. The index showed its location, yet the corresponding ledger contained no entry for that date. In its place was a blank space, neatly ruled as if an entry had been planned but never completed. The missing entry was brought to Charles's attention. He instructed the clerk to search the supplementary files in case the record had been misfiled, but no such file could be found. After a brief discussion with Edwin, Charles wrote a replacement entry in a separate sheet, using information from other sources to reconstruct the details. This sheet was then sent to the Board of Health in place of the original ledger page. The absence of the original record was not mentioned in the reply. Around this same time, Samuel Kerr, the municipal clerk who had noticed earlier delays, made another visit to Dock Street. His request concerned a single case from the previous year, and he expected the usual promptness. Instead, he was asked to return the following week. Kerr, accustomed to the mortuary's efficiency, made no objection, but noted privately that the delay seemed unnecessary for a recent file. When he did receive the record, it was in perfect order, but the handwriting in the margins differed slightly from the rest of the entry. The difference was minor enough that it could have been the work of a different clerk, yet Kerr found it unusual that the main entry and the marginal note were clearly written at different times. Within the mortuary, the clerks began to notice that certain sections of the archive were increasingly off-limits. Entire shelves, once accessible for daily retrievals, were now locked or moved into the brothers' private office. When asked about these changes, Edwin explained that they were part of a reorganization intended to protect older volumes from wear. While the reasoning was plausible, the clerks could not help but observe that the restricted volumes often corresponded to the years in which irregularities had been found. It was during this period that a fourth type of anomaly emerged, one that differed from the earlier irregularities. While preparing the monthly reconciliation of municipal contracts, a clerk found that several invoices had been reissued with new serial numbers. The originals, still present in the files, bore the same amounts and client names, but had been stamped as superseded in red ink. The reissued invoices were dated several weeks after the originals, yet the services listed were identical. When the clerk inquired about the duplication, Charles stated that the Board of Health had requested updated forms for their own filing purposes. The explanation was accepted, though no such request had been received in writing. As winter approached, the volume of external inquiries into past records unexpectedly increased. Some came from municipal offices, others from charitable organizations, and a few from private individuals seeking to confirm details of older arrangements. Each of these requests passed through the brothers' review before being fulfilled. In some cases, the requested file was sent in its entirety. In others, a prepared summary was delivered instead, accompanied by a note stating that the original was under preservation. The cumulative effect of these measures was to create an environment of quiet control around the mortuary's archives. The brothers remained courteous and responsive to all official requests, yet they increasingly dictated the form and timing of the information provided. This control extended even to long-standing institutional clients, who began receiving more formal correspondence than in previous years. The tone of such letters was precise, measured, and free of unnecessary detail. To outside observers, the Murwalls mortuary continued to operate without disruption. Clients were served, contracts fulfilled, and municipal requirements met. Yet for those within the building, there was a growing sense that the archive had taken on a significance beyond its function as a repository. The brothers' attention to its contents, their insistence on reviewing all documents personally, and the quiet removal of certain volumes from general access suggested that the records themselves had become central to some ongoing matter known only to them. Even routine activities now carried an extra layer of oversight. Clerks preparing end-of-year reports were required to submit their drafts for review before any figures were entered into official ledgers. Cross-checking of data between different sets of records became more frequent, and even small discrepancies were subject to prolonged examination. The process was careful, methodical, and always conducted within the privacy of the office, away from casual observation. By the close of the year, the mortuary's public image remained intact. The changes in procedure had not caused delays significant enough to attract official complaint. and the precision of the returned documents continued to satisfy municipal standards. Yet within the confines of Dock Street, the archive room was no longer just a place where records were kept. It had become the focal point of a process whose purpose, while concealed from clients and authorities, was quietly shaping the way the Murwalls conducted their business. The first clear link between the scattered irregularities emerged in January of 1849, when a municipal inspector named Henry Walcott was assigned to review a series of past contractual records across several city departments. His task was broad in scope, involving not only the Murwalls mortuary but other contractors as well. Walcott's approach was thorough. He compared the ledgers held by the Board of Health with those provided by each contractor, noting any discrepancies in dates, amounts, or annotations. When he reached the records pertaining to the Murwalls, he noticed something unusual. The municipal copies for several contracts from 1845 to 1847 contained details not present in the mortuary's current ledgers. In some cases, these were minor differences in the wording of annotations. In others, entire notations were absent from the mortuary's version. More strikingly, the contracts in question all involved institutional clients, almshouses, small hospitals, and charitable societies, rather than private arrangements. Walcott arranged a visit to Dock Street to examine the mortuary's originals. Charles received him with customary politeness, offering the ledgers for the requested years. As Walcott leafed through the volumes, he confirmed that the differences were real. He made no immediate accusation, instead asking whether the mortuary maintained supplementary notes for such cases. Charles replied that all relevant records were stored in the archive room and available for review, though some older files had been reorganized for preservation. The inspector requested access to those supplementary files. Edwin, who had been listening from the rear office, joined the conversation and suggested that they first identify exactly which entries were in question so that retrieval could be precise. The discussion was cordial but deliberate, with the brothers guiding Walcott toward specific sections of the ledgers. Each time an inconsistency appeared, they provided alternative explanations. A clerical oversight in the municipal office, a misplaced annotation later removed for clarity, or a routine transcription adjustment when copying information between forms. Walcott, while outwardly accepting these explanations, made careful notes of the discrepancies and the brothers' responses. When he requested to see original correspondence associated with the cases, Charles excused himself to retrieve the files. After a short delay, he returned with neatly arranged packets of papers. The correspondence appeared authentic, yet Walcott noticed that many of the letters were undated or bore only the year, without the month and day. This was uncommon for official exchanges, which typically required precise dating. In his own records, Walcott marked these observations for later comparison. Before leaving, he asked whether he might return to review other years. Charles assured him that the mortuary would make its archives available whenever required. Edwin added that they valued transparency and wished to assist the city in keeping its records complete. The inspector left with no outward sign of dissatisfaction, but his private notes reflected a growing interest in the consistency of the mortuary's files. The connection that had eluded casual observers was becoming clearer to Walcott. The irregularities clustered around institutional contracts, and specifically those involving individuals with no immediate family or known estate. In such cases, there were fewer parties to verify the details, and the city relied heavily on contractors' documentation. If a discrepancy occurred, it might pass unnoticed unless examined alongside municipal copies. Within the mortuary, the brothers appeared to sense that the inspector's review was more than routine. They began dedicating even more time to the locked cabinets in their private office, sometimes working late into the evening after staff had gone. On at least 2 occasions, a clerk arriving early in the morning found the office door closed and the faint smell of oil from recently extinguished lamps. No explanation was offered, and the clerks did not inquire. The shift in atmosphere was subtle but steady. The retrieval of certain files now required both brothers to be present, even when the request came from a trusted municipal contact. Some volumes, once freely accessible, were removed entirely from the archive room, leaving gaps on the shelves. When staff asked about these absences, they were told that the volumes were being rebound or cleaned. Meanwhile, Walcott continued his review from the municipal side, comparing the mortuary's responses to other sources. He consulted institutional ledgers, charitable society reports, and the minutes of Board of Health meetings. In doing so, he identified a small number of cases where the mortuary's entries were not only different in detail, but also absent from its current archive. In each such instance, the missing records involved arrangements carried out under municipal funding, often at a fixed rate, with little external oversight. By early February, Walcott's findings were sufficient to warrant a second visit. This time he arrived with a narrower set of requests, focusing only on a handful of cases. Charles met him in the reception room, while Edwin remained in the office. The files requested were produced, but in 2 instances, the brothers provided summaries rather than original documents. When Walcott asked to see the originals, Charles explained that they were undergoing preservation and could not be handled directly. The inspector did not press the point, but noted the pattern. When the original documents might reveal inconsistencies, they were unavailable. When they were available, the entries often matched municipal copies in general form, but lacked the precise annotations found in other sources. The differences were subtle, yet consistent enough to suggest a deliberate method of record alteration or omission. Outside the mortuary, few were aware of Walcott's ongoing review. The Murwalls clients continued to receive the same efficient service, and municipal offices still regarded the establishment as reliable. However, within certain circles of the Board of Health, questions began to circulate quietly about the accuracy of historical records in cases where only the mortuary's documentation survived. Inside Dock Street, the brothers maintained their measured composure. They continued to oversee all archival access, intercepting requests before they reached the clerks. The locked cabinets in the office, once opened only for occasional reference, now became the center of activity. The reasons for these measures remained unspoken, yet the effect was unmistakable. The archive, once a tool of routine business, had become a guarded asset, its contents curated to control what left the building and in what form. For Walcott, the emerging picture was not yet a formal accusation, but a structured hypothesis. The concentration of discrepancies in cases without direct family oversight, the selective unavailability of original documents, and the presence of altered or incomplete annotations all pointed to a consistent internal practice. What remained unclear was its purpose and scope. Determining that would require direct access to the volumes and correspondence now held under lock in the brothers' private office. By mid-February 1849, Henry Walcott had established a quiet routine of cross-referencing municipal records with those available from outside institutions. His objective was to verify contract compliance, yet in the case of the Murwalls mortuary, the process had shifted into something more focused. Each new comparison revealed the same narrow pattern of differences. Small alterations in wording, adjusted dates, or absent annotations, all appearing in records linked to municipal-funded arrangements for individuals without known relatives. When Walcott returned to Dock Street for a third visit, he was met by Edwin rather than Charles. Edwin guided him directly to the office, where the requested files were already laid out in a neat stack. The efficiency of the presentation seemed deliberate, as if to control the sequence in which Walcott examined the documents. Each file matched the municipal record in its core details, but the margins were bare. The small notations Walcott had seen in the city's own copies, often brief remarks about procedural steps, were not present. Walcott asked whether the mortuary typically removed marginal notes when transferring records between volumes. Edwin replied that the ledgers were intended to be permanent documents, and therefore anything considered informal or unnecessary might be omitted during copying. When pressed on whether these omissions occurred for all cases or only for certain categories, Edwin maintained that the practice was consistent across the archive. Although the conversation remained civil, Walcott noted that Edwin's responses were precise without being expansive. No additional information was offered beyond what was directly asked. This economy of explanation, combined with the restricted access to older volumes, reinforced Walcott's impression that the archive was being curated with intent. After leaving Dock Street, Walcott sought additional verification from the institutions listed in the disputed contracts. Most could produce at least partial records of their own, account ledgers, receipt books, or correspondence confirming arrangements. In several cases, these independent records contained the same annotations as the municipal copies, but were absent from the mortuary's current files. The consistency of these external matches made it increasingly unlikely that the discrepancies were the result of random clerical variation. While Walcott did not yet have authority to compel the production of restricted volumes, he began to build a network of related documents outside the mortuary's control. These included invoices from suppliers who serviced the contracts in question, minutes from institutional meetings where arrangements were approved, and correspondence from city officials instructing the mortuary to carry out specific tasks. In assembling these, Walcott created a parallel archive against which the Murwalls' edited records could be compared. The brothers, for their part, appeared aware that the inspector's visits had taken on greater purpose. In March, Charles resumed a more visible role in meeting municipal contacts, perhaps to reinforce the mortuary's long-standing image of cooperation. His tone in correspondence was unfailingly formal and accommodating, but his written responses to document requests became increasingly specific, often limiting the scope of the information provided to exactly what had been asked, without additional context. Inside the mortuary, procedures continued to adjust. The clerks now received explicit instructions on how to prepare files for external review, including which sections of a ledger could be shown and which should be transcribed into clean copies. This guidance was presented as a means of protecting fragile originals, yet the effect was to ensure that certain details remained in-house. Over time, fewer people within the building had direct contact with the restricted volumes. Walcott, recognizing that direct access to those volumes might not be granted, adjusted his approach. He began to focus on identifying the point at which the edits or omissions could have been made. By tracing the sequence of entries in both municipal and external records, he noticed that the differences appeared only in documents held exclusively by the mortuary. Once a record entered the municipal system or an institutional archive, it retained its original annotations. This indicated that the changes had likely been made within the mortuary's own files after the initial submission to outside parties. In late March, Walcott requested a meeting with both Charles and Edwin to discuss what he referred to as procedural consistency. The brothers received him in the office, where the ledgers for the most recent year were placed on the table as a visual reference. Walcott outlined the discrepancies he had observed, presenting them in the form of questions rather than accusations. He asked whether the mortuary had ever undertaken a systematic revision of older records, and if so, what criteria were used. Charles responded first, stating that the mortuary periodically reviewed its archive to ensure accuracy and legibility, particularly when preparing volumes for long-term preservation. Edwin added that in some cases, annotations made in haste or for temporary purposes might be removed if they were deemed unnecessary to the permanent record. Neither addressed why these revisions seemed to occur disproportionately in certain categories of cases. The discussion concluded without resolution, but Walcott left with a clearer sense of the boundaries the brothers intended to maintain. They would answer direct questions, but they would not volunteer information about the scope or intent of their revisions. As spring began, the frequency of Walcott's visits decreased, though his inquiries to other offices continued. He gathered enough parallel documentation to confirm that the mortuary's archive had at some point been altered in a consistent manner affecting a specific subset of cases. The purpose of these changes remained speculative, but the pattern itself was no longer in doubt. Within the mortuary, the adjustments to daily procedure became permanent. The locked cabinets in the brothers' office remained in constant use, and the access restrictions applied to the archive room were not lifted. The clerks carried out their tasks without comment, accepting that the handling of certain records was now the exclusive domain of the proprietors. By the end of April 1849, the two parallel processes, the brothers' careful control of their archive and Walcott's methodical reconstruction of its original form, had reached a point of quiet equilibrium. Each side understood that the other possessed only part of the whole picture. For the moment, Both maintained their positions without direct confrontation, the matter contained within the realm of ledgers, annotations, and the deliberate management of what could be known. By the summer of 1849, the exchanges between the Murwalls mortuary and municipal offices had settled into a controlled pattern. Requests for information were met promptly, but with a consistent limitation on what was shared. When originals were provided, they were always in perfect condition and free of marginal detail. When summaries were sent instead, they were formatted in a uniform style that left little room for interpretation. The precision of this system impressed some officials, even as others noted that it left fewer avenues for verifying details independently. The changes, though subtle in appearance, gradually shaped how the mortuary was regarded within Boston's administrative circles. Among those who dealt regularly with Dock Street, it became understood that the Murwalls records were definitive for any case in which no other independent account existed. This reliance gave the brothers a quiet authority over certain historical details of municipal operations, particularly those involving institutional contracts from earlier years. Henry Walcott's review, while never publicly announced, continued in the background. His findings were presented in periodic internal memoranda to the Board of Health, where they were read and filed without formal resolution. The memoranda stopped short of making direct allegations, instead framing the issue as one of procedural divergence between municipal and contractor archives. This phrasing, deliberately neutral, allowed the matter to remain an internal concern rather than a public dispute. Within the mortuary itself, the deliberate pace of operations was maintained. The archive room, though still functional for most daily purposes, no longer held the complete historical record. The locked cabinets in the private office had become a permanent fixture of the business, and access to them was limited to the brothers alone. The clerks, long accustomed to handling every part of the record-keeping process, adjusted to the reduced scope of their responsibilities without complaint. For clients, the visible aspects of the mortuary's service remained unchanged. Arrangements were conducted with the same attention to detail, correspondence was answered promptly, and accounts were managed without error. Institutional partners continued to value the Murwalls' reliability, and the city saw no reason to alter the contracts that had functioned smoothly for years. In this respect, the irregularities identified by Walcott had no immediate effect on the mortuary's standing or its operations. Over time, the quiet authority the brothers held over certain records became embedded in the city's administrative memory. Younger clerks entering municipal service learned to treat the mortuary's ledgers as a final point of reference for past cases. When a question arose about an arrangement from years before, it was often resolved simply by consulting the Dock Street files. Even those who suspected that the archive was selective in its completeness accepted it as the most accessible source available. This reliance was reinforced by the passage of time. As older municipal staff retired, and institutional records from the 1840s were gradually dispersed, misplaced, or destroyed, the mortuary's versions of events became increasingly difficult to challenge. The annotations and marginal notes found in municipal copies during Walcott's review faded from active memory, surviving only in a few internal documents that were rarely consulted. By the early 1850s, the events of 1848 and 1849 had become a closed subject within the Board of Health. The memoranda that Walcott had submitted were stored in a filing cabinet along with other routine administrative correspondence, indistinguishable from reports on supply contracts or inspection schedules. No follow-up action was recorded, and no formal directive was issued regarding the differences between municipal and mortuary records. The Murwalls, for their part, made no reference to the matter in their own files. Their ledgers for the new decade were kept with the same precision as before, though the practice of maintaining locked supplementary volumes continued. These volumes were never mentioned in correspondence and were referenced only in the briefest of internal notations. For all practical purposes, they existed outside the official framework of the mortuary's operations. Dock Street itself changed slowly during this period. New warehouses appeared along the wharves, and some older offices were replaced by more modern buildings. The mortuary's brick facade, however, remained unaltered, a fixed point in a district where change was constant. The brothers kept the property in good repair, ensuring that the building presented the same reserved appearance it always had. As the decade progressed, the memory of the earlier irregularities diminished further. The city's reliance on the mortuary's records was reinforced by the fact that they were organized, accessible, and free from the minor errors that sometimes appeared in municipal archives. This practical advantage outweighed any lingering uncertainty about their completeness. For most purposes, accuracy was measured not by how fully the records reflected the past, but by how well they supported present needs. Within this framework, the Murwalls' control over certain historical details became part of Boston's administrative fabric. The institutional contracts they had handled in the 1840s were referenced less and less often, but when they were, the mortuary's accounts were accepted without question. In the absence of competing sources, the brothers' curated archive effectively defined the official version of events. The staff at the mortuary turned over gradually, with older clerks retiring and younger ones taking their places. The newer employees entered into an environment where the restricted nature of the archive was simply part of standard procedure. They learned which files could be accessed freely, which required approval, and which were never to be requested directly. These boundaries, though rarely explained, were observed without resistance. By the mid-1850s, the episode that had once drawn an inspector's sustained attention was known only to a few individuals, none of whom spoke of it in public. Walcott himself had moved to a different municipal post, his memoranda preserved in storage, but never acted upon. The mortuary continued its work without interruption, its reputation intact, its records still regarded as reliable by those who depended on them. In the years that followed, the Murwalls mortuary maintained a steady presence on Dock Street. The building's exterior showed little sign of age, its windows polished, and the brass nameplate kept free of tarnish. To those who passed by, it remained a quiet, dignified place, unchanged by the passing decades. Inside, the routines were as deliberate as ever, and the archive, both the public ledgers and the locked volumes, continued to be maintained with precision. Institutional contracts evolved as the city's administrative systems became more structured, but the mortuary retained its role in certain categories of arrangements. These were often cases requiring discretion and the ability to manage all aspects without direct oversight from external parties. By this point, the brothers' reputation for efficiency was well established, and newer municipal officials rarely questioned the form or content of the records they provided. The confidence in the mortuary's reliability was such that even minor inquiries from outside agencies were resolved simply by deferring to their documentation. The locked volumes in the private office, once the focus of careful control, were by the 1860s a fixture of the business. Their existence was known only to the proprietors and eventually to a small number of trusted clerks who assisted in their upkeep. The contents were never disclosed outside the mortuary, and their arrangement mirrored that of the public archive, albeit with entries that differed in detail. The locked collection remained in active use for certain internal purposes, though no official correspondence ever referred to it directly. Over time, the original reasons for the separation of records became less clear to those involved. For new clerks, the restricted access was a matter of policy rather than circumstance, and the question of why certain volumes were not part of the main archive was rarely asked. The practice had become institutionalized within the mortuary's operations, preserved not by secrecy, but by habit. When Charles and Edwin eventually stepped back from daily management, the transition was smooth. A senior clerk who had been with the mortuary for more than 2 decades assumed operational control, continuing the procedures that had defined the business for years. The brothers remained involved in oversight, visiting regularly, but their focus shifted to ensuring that the building and its archives, in both forms, were maintained to their standards. As the century progressed, Boston's civic administration underwent significant changes. Departments were reorganized, new offices were created, and the storage of records was consolidated in larger municipal facilities. In the process, many older documents from the 1840s and 1850s were relocated or disposed of according to evolving archival policies. The result was that, in many cases, the mortuary's files became the only surviving source for certain historical arrangements. Researchers who sought information on past municipal contracts often found their way to Dock Street, where the mortuary's ledgers were still kept in impeccable order. These visitors, usually unfamiliar with the city's mid-century record-keeping practices, accepted the completeness of what they were shown. Few would have suspected that the archive represented a carefully curated version of events, shaped by decisions made decades earlier and preserved in that form ever since. The locked volumes remained undisturbed, their presence marked only by the polished wood of the cabinet doors. They were opened infrequently and only for internal reference. The pattern established in 1849 of controlling which version of a record entered the public sphere had become so ingrained that it no longer required conscious enforcement. It was part of the structure of the institution, carried forward by successive generations of staff who had inherited the responsibility without the context of its origins. By the 1880s, the names of Charles and Edwin Murwall were remembered with a certain professional respect. Among older municipal officials, there was an acknowledgement that the brothers had set a standard for efficiency and discretion in their field. Among the younger generation, their names were simply part of the mortuary's history, referenced in the same way as any long-serving proprietors of a stable business. The events of 1848 and 1849 and the inspector's methodical review were not part of that narrative. The mortuary continued to adapt to gradual changes in the city's needs, but its core operations remained consistent. Clients still appreciated its reliability, institutions valued its thoroughness, and municipal offices relied on its archives. The facade on Dock Street weathered the decades with little alteration, a constant amid the shifting city around it. When the century drew to a close, the mortuary's reputation was as firmly established as it had been in its earlier years. The building's brick walls enclosed an archive that shaped not only its own history, but also the recorded history of certain municipal actions. The locked volumes remained where they had always been, holding their parallel record of events. Their contents had never been publicly disclosed, and no official request had ever sought to compare them directly to the public ledgers. The arrangement endured quietly, its origins obscured by time and its continuation assured by routine. In this way, the decisions made in the late 1840s and the system put in place to preserve them remained part of the mortuary's operations into the closing years of the century. They were embedded in the structure of the institution, unchallenged and largely unknown beyond the walls of Dock Street. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.